let me make another suggestion here. So you mentioned Marx, and what we see in Marx is an overestimation, a serious overestimation of the power of reason.
Yeah.
And now reason understood as a productive and political principle. And I mean, obviously there's a religious background because it's a secularization of the Christian story. But I think there are several elements here. And by the way, this goes back to Plato's Republic as well. We can talk about that. But the idea is that, okay, we're going to have a heaven on earth. We're going to have a paradisical society where all men are brothers and so on.
And everyone's needs are met.
Right.
Whatever the hell that means.
But here's the problem. It is going to be realized by human political productive action. And the difficulty there is, so first of all, it's not emerging organically, okay? It's a political constructivism. So the best society will not emerge organically, but it's to be brought into being by man. Now, it's to be brought into being by man in a particular time and in a particular place.
By particular men.
Right, by particular men. And when you put those constraints on it, you drastically limit the possibilities within that society because it's got to be producible, it's got to be sustainable, it's got to fit the particular parameters, all these kinds of things. Add on to that the delusion that human beings are not, in fact, let's say, radically local beings who form the most meaningful bonds in particular ways.
Marriage, family,
et cetera,
town.
Right. But we're universal, right?
Yeah, right.
And finally, you have this kind of divinization of man because after all, we're going to realize heaven on earth. So,
as you said, we can produce a centralized authority, which falls out of the presumptions you just described, that's going to have the computational power necessary to pull off the task.
Exactly.
Which is, that just
huge.
Just that claim is preposterous, right? But I like the way you formulate that because what you're pointing out is that for the system that's proposed to make itself manifest, it has to meet a series of increasingly likely constraints.
Yes, exactly.
Increasingly unlikely constraints. Right. It has to do this. That's already hard. Well, you add 4 more impossibilities to that. It's like,
Right. And where I want to go with this is that kind of hubris about reason is, I think, first of all, it's a characteristic of the modern era because you have Descartes saying we're going to be masters and possessors of nature, and if you read the Discourse on Method,
Nietzsche, we're going to
do these things,
form our own values,
right. But that's sort of the end of the whole kind of decay. But if we go back to the early moderns, he even suggests in the Discourse on Method that maybe medicine will make all the infirmities of old age sort of disappear, which means we're not going to die. In which case, by the way, the religious question is gone. Descartes' writing, he doesn't want his books to be placed on the index, which they were, nonetheless, and so they're read and they have to be, the Roman Catholic Church has to look at them. But the fact is that Roman Catholicism is irrelevant if we're not going to die, right? I mean, in some fundamental sense. But okay.
Well, whatever a human being is something completely different than whatever it is now.
But now I want to go back to Leo Strauss, who talks about the permanent questions. And what I've come to understand is the following, that the permanence of the questions arises from the necessity that Athens, so to speak, and now let's just take that to mean reason, like unaided reason, okay, can't be separated from the biblical alternative, which is the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
How did you figure that out?
Well, Strauss writes about this stuff. He writes about, this is not my ideas. He writes about Athens and Jerusalem. But what I'm claiming is this. In order for reason to function in a healthy way, it must conduct itself in the light of the alternative of religion, which is, like you can't understand everything on your own. There are massive mysteries, right? And there's this entire alternative way of thinking about things. So if you simply separate reason from that, you're going to get totalitarianism and kind of, the lunacy that we see.
Luciferian hubris.
If you separate religion from the alternative that, well, man has reason and man is able to figure things out, and there are things that we can understand about nature and the world and science that aren't in the religious tradition, then you're going to end up with, say, Islamic extremism or something. You see what I'm saying? In other words, a healthy human existence is to dwell in the space of the permanent questions, which must be informed by these alternatives. And Strauss is very good on this. He says, there's no philosophical proof that the Bible is wrong, right? Like you could, you're always making assumptions that are simply going to sort of, prejudice the conclusions that you're going to.
Yeah.
So we have to live in this space. And Strauss's claim, which I really think is great, is that the tension between Athens and Jerusalem is the coiled spring of the greatness of the West, that we have to understand that.
Right. Okay,
but now what I've come to understand, this is a kind of moderation, right? Because if you say, no, reason's it, anything that's not rational, you got some kind of positivism or whatever, you're going to go straight to that man-God thing, right?
Yeah.
You're going to go straight to that totalitarian.
Yeah.
The train's going to stop at the death camp, basically. But if you also say, no, there's no which is one more thing I just want to say about my book on Plato and the Talmud. I've already suggested that Socratic philosophizing begins with this revelation at Delphi, which Socrates takes seriously.
Yeah.
Who is Socrates? What is wisdom? But he's convinced that there must be an answer because the God can't speak falsely. The rabbis, there's a great book called Rational Rabbis by a guy named Menachem Fish. And believe it or not, he talks about the rabbis of the Talmud. The first 40 pages is about Karl Popper's theory of falsification in science, which is a great, humble theory, right? It's that we can't prove laws like the law of gravity. We can only falsify them. We can conduct experiments that if they turn out a certain way, will falsify the formulation of the law of gravity.
Look for new forms of our ignorance.
Right. So then this guy argues that the rabbis are rational, and they are in a sense. They're playing the Socratic game of rationality within the horizon of revelation. Oh. So they start with the Torah.
Okay, I think we know enough about both psychology and neuroscience now to move that from the domain of philosophical theory to the domain of established fact. Because one of the things that people who've studied perception and emotion have come to conclude is that, I asked Carl Friston, who's the world's most cited neuroscientist, by the way, I asked him, is every object perception a micro-narrative?
Oh, that's very interesting.
He said, yes, for sure. He said, necessarily. Right, necessarily. That's quite the claim. Because what we've come to understand is that there's no object perception independent of motivational frame. And the description of a motivational frame is a narrative. Okay, now you made a comment earlier that, you need to know where you've come from and where you're going. Okay, so what is a narrative? There's an aim, there's a starting place, there's a voyage. And then you might say, the world's made out of objects, and you overlay a value-laden narrative on top of it. But then you might say, where's the interface? And so you might say, let's look at how perception works. What do we see as objects? We do not see what the Enlightenment mind conceptualized as the object when we see an object. That's not right. What we see, so what it seems to be the case, it's very cool. So once you establish an aim, and this is in the most trivial of circumstances, the world reveals itself to your perception as a pathway to the aim, as a set of obstacles, that's produces negative emotion, a set of facilitators or tools, that produces positive emotion. And that's with every glance you take, because every glance specifies an aim for action, right? Because otherwise, why look? Okay, so aim, pathway, right? So that might be the straight and narrow pathway uphill, for example.
Right.
Tools and obstacles. Okay,
gotcha.
Positive emotion, negative. On the social front, friends and foes, same thing. Almost everything defaults to the realm of the irrelevant, right? Because if I specify an aim, most things are now irrelevant. So your aim makes most of the world irrelevant. Some things stand out as phenomena. The phenomena that stand out are tools and obstacles or friends and foes. There's also, and I just figured this out this year, there's also agents of magical transformation in narratives. They change your aim. So imagine every aim brings a set of constraints and rules. So that's like the metaphysics of the aim, the rules. But if you switch the aim, the metaphysics change, and that's a magical shift. And if someone comes along whose aim is 4 stages higher than yours, we'll say, then they appear truly magical. But the reason I'm making this case is like, and there is, I think we're at the end of the Enlightenment, and I think it died like Nietzsche claimed Christianity died at its own hand, because it turns out that there is no level at which what we see are dead objects.
Yes.
Not at any level of perception whatsoever.
Yes.
Every object is actually, you cannot dissociate value from object in perception.
Yes.
It's not possible.
Yeah.
In fact, if anything, it's tilted towards value and not object. And there's another terrible plague for the Enlightenment types as well, who think the world is a place of objects, is that, well, there's an infinite number of objects because, well, so then which objects?
Right.
Which objects? That's a terrible question, because as soon as you say that, because you have to prioritize. Well, there's no difference between priority and value.
Yes.
So another way of thinking about a narrative, when you go to a movie, you watch the protagonist, what you are embodying is your observation of the protagonist's structure of value. You're incorporating that. You match his emotions because you match his aims. And so when we're storytelling, what we're doing is we're exchanging information about the substrata within which rationality has no choice but to operate. See, so the metaphysics of the Enlightenment were wrong. Rationality is at the base because the world's made out of objects, and you can calculate your way forward with value-free objective knowledge. Like, none of that's right. So the story's the thing. Now, you said, well, we need a story. We need to know where we've been. And now, that has to have something to do with why you got interested in the Talmud, I would presume. So you said you saw a similarity with the dialogues. So what else caught your attention? You've obviously developed extreme familiarity, for example, with the story of Exodus. Why do you think, as a philosopher, you started to presume or understand that these ancient stories shed light on the world in a way that philosophical theories abstracted away from narrative don't?
Well, look, what you just said is very rich, and I think very, very attractive and interesting. So let me start with a question, I guess. Doesn't this all mean then that we have to find the proper aim, and if we find the proper aim, then our questions are going to be helpful and productive to us as human beings? So let's go back to the very first commandment.
This is why Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which is a guidebook for revelation, he says, okay, how do you pray? How do you orient yourself in the world? Same question. Aim at the highest thing you can conceptualize. That's number one. Presume that other people are made in the image of that highest thing. Okay. So now you've set the frame.
You've got it. Exactly.
Now, pay attention. Having done that, pay attention to the moment, because what'll happen is if you specify your aim properly, the proper pathway will appear, the proper tools will make themselves manifest to you, the proper revelations will come to you. Well, that is how perception and thought work. So in the Tower of Babel is a story of misaligned aim, and it's the engineers who build the tower.
Well, that's a great story too, because if you read it carefully, they say, let's bake bricks. So they bake the bricks. And that's fascinating because they break it out of Adamah, which is the soil that man is made out of, Adam, etc. And then they say, let's make a tower. Now, this may be overinterpreting, but first we'll develop the bricks, and then we'll figure out what to do with them. Like the technological thing comes before. It actually reminds me of like the CIA discovers LSD. I mean, they don't discover it, but they're like, we got LSD. So now their question is, what can we do with it? There's a book about this. And so they say, well, is it a truth serum? So they give LSD to this CIA guy. No, it's not, Well, maybe it's an anti-truth serum. We give it to our agents if they're caught and stuff like that. No, it's not. But this kind of reasoning, right? Like, this is potent stuff. This is super potent stuff. What can we do with it, right? But anyway, you're absolutely right about the misaligned aim.
People end up unable to communicate because the aim gets so misaligned. words themselves lose their meaning.
Yes.
And that's a reference
Yes.
to exactly what we're describing, is that
Yes.
if you mess up the underlying narrative substrate
Yes.
enough,
Right.
rationality becomes impossible, partly because words don't mean the same thing to different people.
Well, that's true.
Right.
Yes.
Well, we can see that now.
But yeah, I mean, and so what you said about the Sermon on the Mount is anticipated by God in the very first commandment. I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods beside me.
Right, exactly.
Now, what's
Exactly.
interesting
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
that